All right, this is Chris with the Salinas Public Library. I'm joined here by Yehudi Mercado and Luis Manzo, also from the Salinas Public Library. Hi, Yehudi, can you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, hi, I'm Yehudi Mercado. I'm a writer, artist, director now. I've used to work in video games for a long time. I was the art director at Disney Interactive, where I worked on stuff like the Guardians of the Galaxy mobile game. That was fun. And then I was also working in comics, self-publishing comics, and then getting published. And now I write and draw graphic novels and develop animation for movies and TV. And I also write narrative podcasts now.
So, that's awesome.
Yeah.
So I was thinking a lot of comic book artists start out doodling things as kids. They start off with something they like to draw. What was something you started off drawing early on?
I was lucky because my father is an artist. So we always had like art supplies around the house. Like I grew up in Houston, Texas, and there was this huge art supply store called Texas Art. And it was like sort of my mecca. Like I always loved going there. So yeah, I always had those giant like architectural like pads that I would draw on. So like
right, those big ones, yeah.
So yeah, I would always draw. At first I would draw like my version of Spider-Man, of course, and then also I loved Garfield, so I would like draw like Garfield. I would translate Garfields into Spanish and like sort of like, my spin on Garfield. And then like one of the first sort of like, I was probably what, like 10, 11. I started to like draw my own comic strip called Mutiny on the County. And it was this cow called Elroy. And that was sort of like, my first stab at like creating my own characters. And it was very much influenced by like Bloom County.
Right, that makes sense. So thinking of Garfield specifically, I know that the art changed quite a bit from the early Garfield to the later Garfield. And I'd read about how it's sort of been simplified in some ways because it's, for one thing, it's easier to draw the same character over and over again.
Yeah.
But what is for you, how do you continue drawing things in a way that stays consistent? The character looks like the same character from one panel to the next panel, that sort of thing.
So it's interesting because I started, I wanted to get into animation first. So in high school, I did theater and I always drew as a kid. So then when I went to college, I sort of combined theater and art, and then that became animation. Right. So I studied animation. So I feel like that starting in animation before comics helped me like keep things on model. Like in animation, you have to keep the character on model. Like he has to look, the same nose as he does, front on as 3/4 front. So right. I got pretty good at like being consistent in that respects. And almost like when I started to do comics, I was almost too tight on my model because it was taking me forever to like finish a page. And then I would like go back through and like look at comics. I'm like, okay, you can loosen up a little bit. Like it's right. It's all about like sort of like getting the emotion out. And
right, there's a sort of feel going there, right?
Yeah.
So would that be the first work you did that kind of resembled a graphic novel, that Elroy?
Yeah, it was definitely more of the 3-panel comic strip, but yeah, sort of like build up like a whole sketchbook of like the character and aliens attacking the farm, and
yeah, of course,
yeah.
That's
what you know.
We were just talking about that recently with Salinas. What if aliens attacked, these fields? We have a lot of crops, but aliens attacking, it's kind of a fun idea.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about some of your more recent works that you've worked on. Some of I know you've done Saifu, which mixes a lot of really interesting elements. So can you tell us a little bit about Saifu?
Yeah, Saifu was an idea I've had for a long time. So I was, I grew up in the 80s, old school hip hop fan. I loved hip hop, and as a kid, I would we were latchkey kids, so we had a lot of alone time after school. So I would put on an album like a Run DMC or Beastie Boys, and then I would almost like choreograph my own like kung fu fights to those, like to those songs. So that sort of like was the initial impetus of like marrying hip hop and kung fu together.
Right.
And then just the title Saifu came to mind, and I was like, oh, it's like sci-fi but kung fu, and like, so basically,
Right.
like, I've been noodling with that idea for a long time, and I would pitch it as a show, but nothing ever like sort of happened. So then I got traction after Pantalones, Texas, my middle grade graphic novel. And I decided like, oh yeah, let me just turn Saifu into like a middle grade like action adventure about a kid
Right.
who's a DJ, and like he scratches the perfect beat, and then that summons him to a robot planet. And it sort of became like a hip hop Wizard of Oz.
Yeah, it's like a supersonic Eurovision with hip hop, and yeah, it's kind of interesting. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's fun.
And so
I
basically everything I loved as a kid sort of like mashed together in like in an adventure.
That seems like a good place to start. Yeah. I was gonna say welcome to Braglio, who joined a little bit ago. If you have any questions, you can ask questions of Yehudi. Let us know if you're interested. You can write something in the chat, or you can comment. And then we can also have time at the end to ask questions. All right, and then how about fun world, which I think has just the right number of funs in it. So,
exactly. Yeah.
Right. So tell us a little bit about that one.
Four is too many. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that one
I found very funny. I was curious about your.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. So yeah, growing up in Houston again, we had Astro World, like the theme park. It was one of those Six Flags theme parks, but like we would go all the time. So I like, I sort of fell in love with amusement parks, and now I'm in LA and we go to Disneyland all the time. And we used to have the annual pass before COVID, but
Right before things happened.
yeah. But so I always like the idea of like, okay, what happens in a theme park at night? Like who's lurking in the shadows of the theme park, and like who's really running the show? So that was then I had this idea that, oh, what if inside the mascot costumes there were aliens, and they thought like the mascot costumes were the Earth skins, and that's how they were blending in with the humans. So that's sort of like what kicked off the comedy of like, okay, what if these aliens think they conquered Earth, but what they only conquered was an amusement park? Because if you figure it's like a little mini world, like it's got a castle, right. It's got trains, it's
right.
Yeah, if you landed from outer space, you'd think like, oh, that's the whole planet right there.
Right, why not?
What more do you need? You got churros. Yeah.
I think churros are an important key part too. If you're going to take over a planet, that's
exactly.
What you need is the churros.
Yeah, what more do you need than churros?
So it sounds like a lot of your, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of your upcoming things in a minute too, but it sounds like a lot of your process starts with just some of your childhood and things that you enjoyed and things that you're interested in. Where do you go from there? What's the next step for creating your work?
Then it's all about like, okay, who's the main character? What's that main character dealing with? And then it's all about, okay, like throw every obstacle at that main character to make him break and see if he can overcome it. Like that's sort of like right. My process of like breaking the story. It's like, okay, you got a poor innocent kid. He thinks he can handle this stuff. Okay, I'm gonna throw all these obstacles at him. And if he rises above it, then he's sort of like, he becomes the hero.
Right. Yeah. And at what point do you start putting it on paper or screen or however you do it?
Yeah, I sort of, I start doodling the main characters. I like to sort of like almost draw what I have in mind as like the poster first. Because right. Sort of like in a nutshell captures like, okay, what's the title look like? What are these, when designing characters, it's good to design them together so they don't all look the exact same. Like that's another thing in animation, like the shapes and silhouettes of the characters are super important. And then like how they lock in together, almost like puzzle pieces, is very important. So I sort of start with almost like a group shot with a title, and then like the sort of personalities start to bubble up from there. And yeah, that's kind of how I start. And then I'll outline that like in Google Docs, just sort of like, okay, this is this character, this is his personality, act 1, act 2, act 3.
That's neat. What do you like to use for your artwork? Do you still work on paper? Do you paper and digital? What do you like to use?
Mainly digital. Like, so my first books I did all in Adobe Flash. which is like an animation program, and like no one should do their books in Flash. It's a crazy way to do it, but it's all vector. Like, I don't know.
Right.
If,
But it worked, but it's not, maybe not ideal is what you're saying.
right, yeah, publishers are like, what are you doing? Like, this is not how you make a book. But uh, I was so, because of animation, I was faster in that program than
Right. Yes.
like on paper, one at a time, scanning that in. And that's another thing I feel like the momentum of making a book, you have to keep that up. Like I always describe as like making a graphic novel is like climbing a mountain. And if you're sort of like slowing down, taking your time, you're just going to give up. Like, so I
Right.
like to like sort of charge up the mountain, like, and sort of like finish it all in like one sort of like chunk of time.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I worked digital when the iPad with the Apple Pencil came out. That sort of like kicked off the sort of new phase of how I'm working. So I'll still do my thumbnails in Flash because it's on a timeline, and I sort of like to see the book on a timeline. So I like at a glance I can see like, oh, all of Act 1 is like taking up 60% of this book. Like I need to like shorten that. And I can sort of
Right.
see that at a glance. And I feel like that's why some people say like, oh, my comic books read as almost like you're watching a cartoon, because like
Right.
it's got that pacing of like a 3-act structure. And
Yeah, very
then
cinematic.
I'll ink it in on the iPad and then color it in Photoshop.
That's great. Do you do all of your like, do you do all of the comic book work, or do you have someone who does other parts like the coloring and things like that?
So I do what I do is like I'll pick the colors and I'll do like model sheets. Like in animation you see like, oh,
Right.
this character, his shirt is this color. So I'll do like the base colors, and then I'll have someone flat for me. So flatting, not traditionally flatting in comic books is just the white silhouette, and it's
Okay.
really just preparing it for the colorist to then take it from there and then pick whatever colors they want. I am so persnickety about color that I set the color first, and then I have sort of my flatters do just the base colors. Like they'll even do all the backgrounds like in shades of gray for me. Like
Right.
I'll tell them like, oh, leave the window bright green so I can easily like, hit that with the magic wand in Photoshop and then change that to another color. So
Right.
like I'll get them to like prepare my files for me, and then
Right.
I go in through and then I sweeten it. So basically I do almost everything except sort of
Right.
the flatting stage.
Yeah. And it's interesting because there are other like jobs in comic book creation, like you were saying, someone whose job is to flatten, which
Yeah.
which sounds, it's a funny title, like I flatten things, but
Yeah.
right. That's really neat. Um, Another comic book you have coming up is, or that's coming out really soon, is Chunky, which I can't wait to get my hands on because I've read some really good reviews about it. I've seen you got a star in one of the book magazines that we get at the library, and I said, "Oh, look, a star! This is great." Which I guess is library talk, but it's exciting when you get that. So, can you tell us a little bit about Chunky?
Yeah. And actually I can
Oh
share
yeah,
the,
that would be great.
right. You can see that. Yeah. Yeah. So Chunky is my middle grade memoir graphic novel. It's all about me as a kid and growing up in Houston, Texas.
Yeah, that's really cool.
I'm overweight, of course. And it sort of like kicks off the story. I had a lot of health problems as a kid. So I had a partial lung removal. So I have one lung. And so my parents were always concerned about my weight and like, the stress it would put on that other lung. So the sort of story kicks off of like my parents telling me, okay, I need to lose weight. And the sort of like the fix for that is like, oh, what if he joins sports? Like my father is an amazing athlete. He's great at every sport. Like, he masters it like instantly. So like, oh, what if Hootie tries sports? But if I'm terrible at sports, like the worst. So basically it's all my journey of like trying out different sports. And to sort of cope with this, I sort of invent this imaginary mascot named Chunky, who is always there to like cheer me on and tell me I'm doing okay. And he's my number one fan. And it's really about like like his relationship with me and like cheering me on through these like trials and tribulations of childhood. But yeah, it's getting great response, and I really wanted to make it funny. So a lot of these it can be a little bit like almost like homework, I feel like.
Right.
And also there's not a lot, this is sort of very much in the Raina Telgemeier memoir space, but there's not a lot of stuff for boys in this space.
Right.
Like we're only starting to get a few more of those now, especially with the new kid, and yeah.
Right.
But yeah, hopefully everyone will like my my journeys through sports.
Right.
Yeah, because
Well,
like
and I like your color use too. You mentioned color earlier, but I think it really kind of stands out.
yeah. You can tell like I'm very persnickety about color. Like I tried to have other people like, just as sort of like an exercise of like, okay, here's the line work. Send me back what you think the colors would be, but I don't know. Maybe I'm too controlling in that respect, but yeah. But yeah, I'm pretty proud of how this turned out because Saifu is all like lasers and
Right.
robots and explosions. So this was a very different kind of story where it's like this, the stakes aren't, are you going to save the planet? It's, can a fat kid get a trophy? Like,
Right.
yeah.
I noticed you do a lot of science fiction. A lot of your work has science fiction elements of some sort. So
Yeah.
it's interesting. I guess you could almost call an imaginary friend something in the fantasy element, maybe.
Yeah, I had
But
to throw in
this is
something.
more
Yeah.
realistic.
Yeah. Yeah.
How do you decide which parts of your biography you want to include in your biographical work? This is maybe a little more biographical than some of your other stuff.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. All the things like,
very different.
especially like, I mean, all the things in this are true,
Right.
they're heightened, of course, but like this page particular, like I couldn't fit in my little league uniform. Like, looking back at like photos, I was like, I wasn't that gigantic of a kid, but they were made for little kids. So like they just
Right.
fit me. So literally, the rule was you had to wear a uniform. So my coach thought, oh, it's better just to cut it open in the middle and tape it together. And it's like, what? That doesn't honor the rule at all. So like literally I had to play a whole game with like my shirt cut open and it taped together with athletic tape. Like, so it's like, yeah, that's painful as a kid, but like in hindsight, that's pretty hilarious. Like,
Right.
yeah.
So you can use a lot of your memories to help build on your creation.
Yeah, and at first I was worried, like, okay, is this just going to feel like just vignettes of stories instead of one overarching story? But it was really, like, oh, it's can he get a trophy? And then by the end, you'll see, like, okay, yeah, I wound up getting a trophy, but in it for a different thing. Like, yeah, spoiler alert. But yeah.
So speaking of, I saw pizza on one of these earlier pages. So you were once a pizza delivery driver, right?
Yeah.
I was once an ice cream scooper right next to a pizza delivery place, and sometimes I had to help throw some cheese on some pizzas and things. So in another interview, they wrote about lemonade quite a bit, and so I had to ask them about lemonade. So I wanted to ask you about pizza. What are the most important elements in just having a good pizza? What do you think's needed there?
You have to have the good dough. Like I feel like the dough makes or breaks a pizza. Like the sauce can be whatever, I feel like, but if you get the dough right, then that works. And then I like a lot of cheese. So like put a bunch of cheese on it and the dough is good. And then and then also like probably the older the surface that it's being cooked on, the better. Like
Right.
it can absorb all the like the pepperoni grease that is collected over the centuries. Like I feel like that adds to the flavor. But yeah, like delivering pizza, because it was like my college, like every summer I would deliver pizza. And it sort of became my time to like just be in my head and think of stories. Like that's sort of like, I feel like why it was such an important time in my life, It was like literally because, you're just in the car, like all day driving mindlessly, like taking a pizza from A to B, but it gave you a lot of like thinking time. And I remember Mike Judge, when he talked about Office Space, how he hated working in a cubicle because it was so taxing mentally, and he couldn't be like thinking of his stories. That it was only when he worked construction that he could sort of like, can turn off his brain for the work and then use his brain to just think of his stories. So I just thought that was interesting, that parallel that, yeah, matched up to my experience.
Right. Did you come up with so which stories did you come up with when you were working pizza? Did you like that you have that story, that graphic novel about pizza delivery, right?
Yeah,
Isn't there a delivery?
yeah, Buffalo Speedway.
Buffalo
Yeah,
Speedway, right?
that one takes place on the busiest pizza day ever, which is June 17th, 1994. Oh,
Did you work on Pizza Day, or is it
I did.
you did?
Yeah. So it was the day of the O.J. Simpson chase.
Ah,
Yeah, so like it became like, so even like that day was crazy busy, but even after that, I thought like, oh, this would be a funny story of like almost like Apollo 13, but for pizza boys, where it's like the perfect storm of all these events.
right.
Because in Houston, it was like the Houston Rockets were in the NBA Finals on that day, and I remember like you'd see the final,
Bronco,
you know,
yeah,
and then the Bronco chase was in the picture in picture, but then over the course of the evening,
they
the
were together.
Bronco main frame, and then the poor Rockets were relegated to the picture in picture.
Yeah. So I saw that you did some work on DC superhero girls. Is that right?
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
what, so what is it like working on a property that, I mean, we talked a lot about your imagination process and some of your ideas. What's it like working on something that's maybe someone else's original idea or their concepts?
yeah. That was fun. I did storyboards for, it was like season 4 of the DC superhero girls, and it was great. Like I found that they were pretty easygoing with like gags I would come up with. All the scripts were
Right,
written by someone else and like set, so
right,
you had to work within the framework.
right,
But being such a comic book fan, I felt I brought stuff to the table, and even like it was funny because it was like the director. I had this thing where Wonder Woman was flying, and he's like, I don't think Wonder Woman flies, and I'm like, excuse me, like superhero girls, she flies like that. So I was able to like bring my knowledge to the table.
right. You influenced the plot a little bit
Yeah,
with your knowledge of comic books.
yeah, yeah.
That's great. Uh, are there some comic book artists or comic books that you that kind of help inspire you, or that you found foundational to your work?
Yeah, because when I was like, uh, self-publishing Buffalo Speedway, I was looking around. There weren't many like just straight up comedies like in comics
Mhm.
book. Like it was more spoofs like of things rather than just like straight up like comedies.
Right,
So actually, Scott Pilgrim, like Brian Lee O'Malley's Scott Pilgrim, was
right,
basically like, oh, he can do that. It's sort of like breaking the world rules of reality with video games, uh, and it's sort of like it turned a light bulb over my head. And even like in the '90s with Scud, the Disposable Assassin by uh, Rob Schrab, like that also was like, oh, you can do funny action comedy
right,
with cartoony looking characters, but like are
right.
still cool. Like that was definitely a big influence on me.
Yeah, and I had mentioned the science fiction, but comedy is definitely the backbone of a lot of your work.
Yeah. Yeah, I think just the time I grew up, Star Wars was like a religion in my family, and like, E.T. and just like all those 80s sci-fi movies were so like foundational to my
Right,
storytelling.
right. Um, so what else are you had said that you were working on something else coming up. What else were you working on?
Yeah, so I'm working on a Saifu 2, and it's called Saifu It Takes Two. And yeah, that it's going to be crazy because I sort of challenged myself to not, just replicate the first book.
Right,
And it's all about hip hop, so like I wanted it to feel like, oh, Wax, the main character, had a hit with his first album, which was the first book, and
right,
then how does he deal with his sophomore slump? So it's almost like
right,
like that's part of the narrative of like him like trying to like outdo his previous adventure.
Right.
And it's the sort of, but yeah, I'm working on that, and then I'm working on a Shazam graphic novel for DC.
Oh, neat.
Yeah, yeah, and that one, it fits in the movie cinematic universe. So I
Okay,
came
yeah,
up with a story of Shazam that basically fit during that first movie with Zachary
right,
Levi. So it
right.
takes place all within the montage of that first. So I
And that
thought,
seems like it would fit you really well because you've got the comedy and you've got
yeah,
the superhero comic stuff, so it's fun.
yeah, that was great because it was almost like with Shazam, and then when I read the script for Guardians of the Galaxy when I worked on that game, it was before anyone knew the tone of the movie or like even the characters. Like,
Right, right.
Guardians of the Galaxy were not well known,
Not,
characters. When I
not a
read
big property.
the script, I was like, oh, this is my sensibility exactly. Like so that and Shazam felt like, oh, those are like that's my wheelhouse. Like I
Right.
can do this kind of stuff. So got that, and then working on Chunky 2, where Chunky goes to camp. So it's all about my time going to summer camp.
That's
And
fun.
yeah, yeah.
I have a few questions if you don't mind, Chris.
Oh yeah.
Fun, Luis.
Um, how often do you draw? Are you drawing all the time, or is it just like a few hours a day? Um,
Yeah, it's pretty much around the clock. Like I have no work-life balance. Like literally my work desk is like in my living room with my TV. Like so yeah, it's mainly I draw, and that's a good thing with writing and drawing, because drawing an entire graphic novel is very physically taxing on you. So I'm able to like draw for half the day and then write for the other half of the day. Like I feel like I can sort of sit in a different position and like write than I do like drawing. And even like coloring is on my desktop, but then the inking is on the iPad, and I can sort of take the iPad anywhere and ink anywhere. But, yeah,
um,
so it's pretty,
what?
but I pretty much work like I don't know, 18-hour days. Is that possible?
Yes.
Yeah.
What piece of advice do you have for, let's say, someone like me, or a teenager or someone else who wants to start drawing their own graphic novel, and they are not very good at drawing or writing, but they have an idea and they want to get that idea on paper?
Yeah. Yeah, and we spoke about this a little bit earlier, but yeah, I'm working with my nephew because he's really like, it's this energetic kid, and he's always bubbling with ideas, and I keep trying to like rein him in and tell him like, just do a 4-page comic book. Just start with 4 pages, like, beginning, middle, end. Like, if you can do that, finish that. That's the most important part of starting out, is like completing a project, because so many people I know are like stuck on that first 3 pages of a 300-page graphic novel, like, and it's like it gets daunting because it's like climbing a mountain. But you gotta be able to finish a project, then set it aside, and then immediately start on that next project. Like that's the most important thing. It's just like keep generating content, keep making, completing, then moving on. I feel like that's the most important part, because then you'll start to see like, oh, I'm falling into these tropes, and like you start to see where oh, is this character compelling enough? Like you'll really see like when you start to draw it out, it's like, oh, my main character isn't even in these 2 pages, and it's like, oh, maybe he's not the main character. Then you start to see like, oh, maybe this other character is more interesting and he should be the main character. Like you'll start to just see that like easily when you try to complete those 4 pages.
Nice.
Yeah.
You mentioned that your dad is an artist as well.
Yeah.
So I'm imagining that, when you were a kid, you were drawing a lot. And then when the iPads came out, and then you had to transition from paper to iPad, was that a little bit challenging? Was that easy? How would you describe that transition?
Yeah, actually, it was pretty easy for me because even as a kid, we had my mother worked in the Houston Independent School District, and we had access to computers pretty early on. So I was pretty lucky to like dive into computers early. And we had this thing called the Koala Pad, and it was like the first pad with a stylus. It was tethered to the pad, like it wasn't wireless. But I would draw, like that all the time as a kid. And so when it came time for the Wacom Intuos to come out, it was like second nature. So like I picked up digital drawing pretty easily. And even like I would see like traditional artists, they would hit that sort of speed bump of like that transition time. Because at the video game company I worked at, as right out of college, we would hire traditional animators, and we would see how they would just struggle with the, knowing the program, knowing how to like save files, and like it was really like a sort of chore. So I feel like I never had to go through that hump. And also I went to the Austin Community College at the same time I was going to the University of Texas. So UT, I did all the fine arts, the painting and the, life drawing. But then at ACC, they had all the actual like, here's Photoshop, here's how to work and open a file and save a file and in Photoshop. So I feel like that was pretty crucial to me, like immediately getting that job at that video game company and knowing all the software. Like, before I could apply knowing that software, where at that time, not a lot of people had the traditional drawing and knew the software.
Nice.
Yeah.
Again, I'm new at this. I want to get my ideas on paper and do my own graphic novels, a few pages. How do I come up with my own characters and my own story, something that's interesting?
Yeah, that's the key. I mean, it's got to be a story that only you can tell and that you're burning to tell. Because like if it's not something that is like a compulsion, then you're going to give up on it. Like I feel like it's almost like a thorn. It's like you got to deal with it. You got to like pluck it out. That's the way. I feel like I have so many stories in my head, and like it's like literally like it's like I need to get this fun world out of my head and onto paper so I can move on to chunky. Like it feels like that a little bit. So like if it doesn't feel like like you can't sleep at night because it's just like gnawing in your brain, you got to get it out. Like I feel like that's the key to like keeping up that momentum and finishing projects. So it's like, yeah, it's really got to be something in you that you need to get out. Because I do see a lot of like people like, younger people at conventions, they just want to like immediately write a Spider-Man. And it's like, you're not going to get to do that right out the gate. Like, they want to see what you bring to Spider-Man. So like, that's the way, like write your own story, the only one that you can tell. And then, hopefully you'll get noticed. But I feel like it's easier and easier now to get noticed, like, with putting stuff online and gaining traction that way. Yeah.
Nice. You mentioned that you work with Flash.
Yeah.
Which I think is it CC?
Yeah, it's now called Adobe Animate.
Yeah, Adobe Animate.
Yeah.
How would you create your characters? Would you use a mouse, a touchpad, or a pencil to sketch your characters, or was it just shapes and that was it?
No, I used the Wacom pen and then the Cintiq. So the Cintiq is the one that you can see the screen. The Intuos is the one that's not the screen. It's sort of like off to the side. But yeah, I use the Wacom Cintiq and like just sketch right into Photoshop or Flash.
Would you animate your characters in CC or Flash just for fun?
I haven't done that in a while. Yeah. I mean, because storyboarding is kind of like animating, but I feel like it's so time consuming to animate. Like, people don't realize, like 24 frames per second means like 24 drawings. Like
yeah.
But I feel like I'm more because I like to work fast. Like I'm satisfied when I sort of like crank out like the storyboards for something, rather than the sort of like the fluid animating. And I was never that great of an animator. I feel like I'm more of a sort of storyteller or storyboarder than like the technical animation, because that's a technical skill.
Nice. Yeah, I would do paper cutouts here for the library.
Oh,
and
nice.
Then, we would do stop motion.
Oh yeah.
And I did a few tutorials, and some of my coworkers were asking me, "Wait, your tutorials like 10 minutes long just to show them how to do a 3-second animation.
Yeah.
Yeah, how long is your video, Luis? It was 3 seconds.
I know.
Oh, that's really cool.
Yeah, like, and that's why I kind of liked animating digitally, is you get that almost instant reward of like, you work all night to try to finish that, 3 seconds of animation, but then you can see it, like you play it and it's like, oh, look, it's alive. Like, and Ryan Woodward is an animator, storyboard artist. I went to a sort of panel with him at the CTN Expo, and he would talk about how, like, the artist process, it's all about like firing those synapses in your brain, and it almost becomes like little charges of like happiness, like, when you complete something, and then that becomes addictive, and I sort of like, I've been thinking about that ever since. It's like,
Yeah, your brain's giving you a reward.
yeah, for completing a page, and like you can sit back and look at it before you go to bed. It's like, oh yeah, I did it. Like, so it keeps you going.
Nice. Thank you.
Yeah.
And Braglio, did you have any questions?
No, I do not. Everything has been answered for me.
Okay, great. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks.
So let's say someone has created their comic, and they would like to kind of get it out there. Do you have any suggestions or advice for how where do they start with that?
It used to be Tumblr was a good place. I feel like that's no longer got the traffic. I feel like Go Comics can use self-publish, and Topopo, I feel like. I don't know what the high traffic ones are, but there are sites that are like that you can self-publish. I mean, I think
Right.
they will look at them for content and make sure, like,
Right.
not like something that needs to be pulled. But I feel like there's a low bar to like be able to like just put your stuff online. I mean, the most important is to be consistent and to generate lots of content, because
Right.
if they see like you've only done 3 pages and then that was like 5 years ago, like, oh, you're not serious about that. Like,
Right.
you see that you've cranked out 3 pages a week for the past year, they're like, oh, okay.
Right.
This guy.
I feel like you do a pretty good job marketing yourself, which is one of the reasons I wanted to ask about it. It seems like you know how to get yourself out there. You've got merchandise on your head right now, which is awesome. You've got Chunky on your head.
Yeah, I learned from the Spike Lee with the school self-promotion. Like, yeah, like he publicizes all his movies wearing the merch. So, like, all right, I like that. Yeah. And because I mean, indie comics, it's like you're the marketing department. So, like,
right, you have to do it all. If you want to get noticed, you have to put in the footwork to social media and things that you need to put yourself out there.
Yeah. With Chunky, I mean, this is the first time it's with like a real book publisher. Like,
yeah, it's a big publisher, right?
With HarperCollins, so I'm feeling like, oh, now this is a different level. Like, I feel like I don't have to be the one like tap dancing in front of comic book stores. Like,
right.
But yeah, it's been a great experience.
Well, Yehudi, thank you so much for joining us and talking about comics. It's really helpful because I think some of the people that watch these are trying to create their own stuff, and I think hearing your process will help them.
Thanks. And yeah, I'll send you the link to my process video.
Yeah, and we'll share that video too so that people can see the process is going to be helpful.
Awesome.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Yehudi.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, Braglio, for coming. And I'll stop the recording. Thank you.
Yeah.